Hello and welcome to History After All. We have once again a very special guest with us. Alex Fitzgerald is here with us to talk about the Third Anglo-Afghan War. It is a widely neglected topic. It is Alex's thesis topic. As promised, the viewers might remember that I promised to bring Alex back on the channel in our first video that we did on the Central Asian Revolt of 1916. It was a great video. It was received well. We loved recording it, or at least I did. It was very enjoyable and it was a very enlightening opportunity for me. I'm trusting that this one will be like that as well. We will be, first of all, Alex, welcome. How are you? It's great to have you on here again.
Yeah, it's great to be here on here. I had a lot of fun last time, so I'm very excited to do this again.
Unlike last time, we are both now at home. I'm in Turkey and you're in the US. We are both done with our theses, which is again why we're here recording this video because we will be talking about your thesis. How was your move from Dublin to the US? How are you liking the US that you found after 2 years
The
abroad?
the US that I returned to, I'd say me and you our boats are a little bit similar, aren't they? But we're doing okay. It doesn't seem all hopeless over here. The move was great. Once I got everything into suitcases, then the anxiety was gone, and I could just have my last few pints in Dublin and then get on a plane hungover. I adjusted pretty quick when I got back here, and now I'm just kind of recuperating after 2 years of European debauchery.
Again, it's great having you here. I'm very excited, and I am no promises, but I am hoping to see Alex in the future as well with related or maybe even unrelated projects or videos. We will be talking about the Third Anglo-Afghan War today. The words are difficult for me to pronounce because you say Afghan and I say Afghan. If I mess it up, please bear with me. First of all, it's an interesting topic. The first question will be why that topic?
In my undergrad, I had to write my thesis because of the class of the thesis that I was taking, my history thesis. I had to write it on something in the Victorian era. So I wrote it on the Second Anglo-Afghan War because I thought it was very interesting just to me. It appealed to me just in general. When we were selecting our thesis here in our international war studies program, I think everybody was doing something of very modern. Everyone was doing international affairs and international law or some kind of diplomacy paper. And then there was the two lowly historians in the program that were going a little bit farther back. You ended up doing Turkey in the Second World War, and I ended up doing the Third Anglo-Afghan War. And I've become kind of a Afghanistan mini expert accidentally. I didn't go into this program planning to do the Third Anglo-Afghan War, but appealed to me just because of how understudied it really was. It really just made sense to do it because there was so much of a story there once I read the actual sources, secondary literature and primary sources that I could find. And it was just too interesting to not do after I'd had that.
Side question, why is it so understudied, really? Why is it neglected that much?
Would say it's a mix of a lot of things. Time period and time frame is probably the most major one. You have it's in 1919. The war lasts a total of about a month and a half of fighting, if that, depending on who you ask. So you don't have a long time to actually see what's going on. There's not really a world reaction because of where it is and how long it's taking. And it's just after the most brutal conflict in history, while all of the belligerents are meeting in Paris to negotiate peace. It really falls through the cracks of contemporary recognition and history now. One of the greatest sources that I read was the King of England not even knowing it had happened until Montague told him a month after the peace was already signed with Afghanistan and the British Empire. So it really snuck under the radar for everyone back then as it does now.
But it's not unimportant at all, is it?
Oh, no, it is the formation of modern Afghan statehood. Afghanistan had been a state before, but it did not become, as Christopher Wyatt at least puts it, it did not move into the modern era until the Third Anglo-Afghan War had gained its independence from the British Empire.
Assuming that most of our viewers will not be that familiar with the topic or with Afghanistan at all, could you provide a little bit of historical background for us? This is the Third Anglo-Afghan War. What were the first and second like? What were the impact of the previous wars? And how many Anglo-Afghan wars are we talking about in total? Is it third? Do we count the current ones as
Well,
it's complicated, isn't it?
it's even more complicated when you count. Do you count tribal issues between in the era between the Afghan wars? What contemporaries of back then would call cis-border issues or cross-border tribal issues now, because those were the most common and they happened probably once a decade within the 70-year span of the three Anglo-Afghan wars. Afghanistan as a genesis really starts after the collapse of the Durrani Empire. That is also where my knowledge begins. If you ask me about something before that, it's really outside my historical wheelhouse. Part of the Islamic gunpowder empires that are very interesting, but don't have much room in my brain. Afghanistan is basically a bunch of collapsed sirdars or minor lords, and after a bit of conflict, gets unified into a one Afghan emirate or kingdom under Dost Muhammad Khan of the Barakzai dynasty. After a bit of a trade dispute
Sorry,
and
when
going.
are we talking about? Around what time period are we talking about?
The 1830s is when it fully unified. In the 1840s is when the first Anglo-Afghan War happens, and it was really a properly colonial war. It was a expedition into Afghanistan that ended with a massacre, followed by an actual military campaign into Afghanistan to fight them and hopefully take them under control under General Elphinstone. Unfortunately for them, they Afghans actually had better weaponry than the British had at that time, and completely massacred all the camp followers and the entire military. I do not know the number of dead off the top of my head, but it is very, very high. And of course, there was a revenge campaign that isn't counted as part of the first war, but the first war was basically Afghanistan pointing itself out and saying it is an established state, not just like a tribal confederation that you would find in Africa. Fast forward about 40 years, and the Great Game is in full swing, even as it was back then, but now it really is in the 1870s. And Russia tries to enter Afghanistan diplomatically. Therefore, the British Empire desires to enter from the southeastern border and is denied. The people who denied them at the southeastern border were unaware that the Russians were allowed entry at the northern border. This misunderstanding leads the British Empire to invade. They invade, they topple the emir, they install their own emir. They think the war's over. The Treaty of Gandamak is signed in 1879. The war actually lasts to 1881 because they completely misunderstand how the Afghans view their overlords or their tribal society. Through varying misunderstandings, the occupation of Afghanistan for those 2 years actually very much reflects the occupation of Afghanistan by the US. Just trials and tribulations, and eventually it all comes crashing down. They do technically win the war, and they have them as a diplomatic protectorate, meaning they are not able, Afghanistan is not able to perform any of its own diplomatic negotiations or diplomatic relations with anybody except through British India. So they couldn't have a relationship with anyone besides the British. It's hard because they were not in name a protectorate. So it was very difficult to try to pin down what that title would be and what they're gaining independence from. But diplomatic independence is the biggest war goal of the Third Anglo-Afghan War, which took place in 1919.
So, aside from the First and Second Anglo-Afghan Wars, what kind of historical background are we looking at? What kind of a country is Afghanistan in the early 1900s?
In the early 1900s, Afghanistan went into a definite cultural and national identity shift, much like a lot of the Middle East. I referenced the Arab Awakening that kind of was very, very similar. After the Second Anglo-Afghan War, the Iron Emir, who looks very cool, Abdur Rahman Khan, purposely did not modernize anything about Afghanistan so that he could not seem attractive to foreign invaders. It was one of his biggest issues. He also ruled the country like a despot. He committed a genocide against the Hazara people. He was very brutal, and he was the first centralized ruler of Afghanistan, the very young Afghanistan. Once he died, there was a peaceful transition of power, the first ever peaceful transition of power in Afghan history, and depending on who you ask, possibly the last, if you don't count assassinations that lead to successions. Habibullah Khan takes power and starts to not undo his father's
In 1901, am I right?
1901, correct. He does not start to undo his father's anti-modernizations, but he starts to invite people back, characters like Mahmoud Tarzi, who was an Afghan but was a contemporary of your own Mustafa Kemal, and who had very similar ideas to Mustafa Kemal. So characters like that would be invited back to Afghanistan very soon after Abdur Rahman's death, and they kind of stoked this new formation of nationalism within Afghanistan, the good kind of nationalism, the kind of nationalism that inspires education, inspires military and cultural reform. There were some of the most liberal voices in there, wanted women in schools. Women didn't need head coverings. Of course, women in Afghanistan at that time were in a much better position than they are in Afghanistan now. It would be a disservice to Afghan history to say that the Taliban brought Afghanistan back to what it was 100 years ago. It was never this bad. So Mahmoud Tarzi himself forms the first publicly owned newspaper. He helps form the first military academy with some other like-minded voices. So they really take the country into a new age of almost Central Asian enlightenment, as I saw some scholars call it. But that comes with some friction because there's also extremely fundamentalist voices within the Sunni ulema, within other parts of Afghan culture, the more tribal areas of Afghanistan, because it's more interconnected than ever. I mean, you have tribes that would be unseen by other parts of Afghanistan for a decade until a trader would come by. Now you have roads being built, and you have one single railway being built from Kabul to Kandahar. This is all in the 1901 to 1910 around. With that builds anti-British sentiment. And the anti-British sentiment is not alone of the more nationalist parties. There is a constitutionalist party that's forming that wants a fully constitutional monarchy. They see the British as a obstacle against that. The fundamentalists view the British as infidel overlords, was one of the sources, more or less just impeding the proper governing of the country. And the fundamentalists and the nationalists were fully at each other's throats within Afghanistan, especially in high Kabul society, for the entirety of the pre-war 1900s. The only thing they could actually agree on was that the British Empire was terrible for Afghanistan. And over time, especially as World War I started to loom, they would become more able to do something about it.
We could maybe say anti-British sentiment is what brings people together across space and time within their own countries and abroad.
Who can blame them? I mean, you have somebody who just fully says you can't be a country. You can establish yourself as a culture, you can have a nation state. You can't conduct anything that would make you a modern country. We keep you in the dark. You are basically a subject of our subject. You are a subject of British India, who is in turn a subject of the actual British Empire. And not only are you a subject of British India, you are fully only under the authority of the Northwest Frontier Province, which is a military province in a subject within a subject.
So, from an administrative standpoint, Afghanistan is not considered a country. It is a subject to a military administration within British India.
Would be how the British saw them if they were being practical. If they were asked officially, they would say, of course, Afghanistan is a country, they're our ally. But it was much more complicated than that. And if you asked a random nationalist Afghan on the street of Kabul, especially if they were a contemporary of someone like Mahmoud Tarzi, they would say, we won't be a country until we are free of British influence within our country.
So, as the early 20th century progressed, what kind of process did Afghanistan undergo? How effective or how impactful was the First World War on Afghan nationalist sentiments or the relationship between Britain and Afghanistan?
It's funny as the message sent to Amir Habibullah by Lord Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, was probably sounded, describing the multitude of alliances that kicked off against each other. Habibullah probably read it and said, "What are they doing over there?" He was warned by the Viceroy to maintain the Treaty of Gandamek's clause of neutrality, which Habibullah fully intended to do. However, there were voices that saw in Kabul that saw the war as the opportunity to finally be free of the British. Of course, we know that there was tons of on both sides of World War One attempts to sway the colonial spheres of one power against another. The Germans and the Ottomans tried to do it against the British. The British much more successfully did it against the Ottomans, and the Germans and the British did it against each other in Africa. Afghanistan was no exception. What kicked it off was what I think personally fully kicked off the lead up to the Third Anglo-Afghan War in 1919 happened in 1916 when Oscar Niedermayer and Otto von Hentig, two German ambassadors, had gone through Turkey, through Persia, and into Afghanistan on the Niedermayer-Hentig mission with other Ottoman advisors as well to try and sway Afghanistan to open up a front in the Northwest frontier. There were voices within Afghanistan that were very eager to listen to them. Luckily for Afghanistan at that time, Habibullah was a crafty statesman. He accepted the party because if he didn't, then he would be viewed as being pro-British. He listened to what Hentig and Niedermayer had to say, and then he sent them away. He gave them an ultimatum that said, "I will attack the British if you give me an X amount of weapons that are ridiculous, X amount of troops that were ridiculous, and this guarantees and these kind of subsidies that the British are paying us." And Hentig and Niedermayer had to leave eventually because it was clear that they were never going to be able to do this, and Afghanistan was never going to attack the British Empire on its own free will.
Side note,
There, yeah,
apologies. While I was reading your thesis, at that exact point, I thought Afghan diplomacy in the First World War in some ways resembled fundamentally the Turkish diplomacy in the Second World War, because that's what the Turkish administration did basically, ask for more and more supplies to enter the war, and the supplies never came, and Turkey never really went to war. It's a
it's
very simplistic explanation, but there are some parallels.
we know where the parallels come from because you have three major characters are the ones that dealing with Niedermayer and Hentig and the Free Indian Congress that had fled to the Ottoman Empire and then to Afghanistan with the Niedermayer Hentig mission. You have three main characters that are there. You have the foreign ambassador, even though they weren't supposed to name a foreign ambassador under the Treaty of Gandamek, was now Mahmoud Tarzi, who studied with Mustafa Kemal, and he conducted very similar diplomacy with the Niedermayer Hentig mission. And you have Habibullah, the emir, and you have Habibullah's brother, Nasrullah, who we will probably get to.
Mahmoud Tarzi is a very interesting character. We need to focus more on him either in this video or if we should, but if we make another video, he's a very interesting character. He actually died in Turkey, died in Istanbul in 1929, as far as I remember, and he was working within more or less the same circles as the Young Turks in the late 19th century and early 20th century. He's a very interesting character. I'm not sure there is a slight generational gap between him and Mustafa Kemal, but the intellectual and political circles were very, very similar.
But he was older, was he not? Yeah, he was a mentor from what I read. Uh,
I have not read anything like that in Turkish sources, but that does merit further research. I don't want to.
Gap between them. During the Niedermayer Hentig mission, there were characters in Kabul that were more open to hearing some of their plans. One of them was Habibullah's brother, Nasrullah Khan. He was a Sirdar, which is just a major lord in Afghanistan. He had a political position, but he was much more what we would call at this point pro-war. One of the many different constitutionalists, nationalists, fundamentalists that were the pro-war party in Kabul. He was much more pro-war and less, I would say, practical than Habibullah. He was open to hearing from Otto von Tenhig a plan on staging a coup in Kabul and establishing himself as emir. It didn't help that Habibullah's second son, Inayatullah, was also open to this notion, as long as he would be himself named heir apparent to Nasrullah, sidestepping Habibullah's heir apparent and only legitimate son, Amanullah, legitimate being not child of a concubine. So you have this actual formation of high level characters in Kabul deciding that it was about to be time to change the leadership and go and take on the fight to the British.
To summarize, we have a ruler that is keen on maintaining a neutral diplomacy and staying out of the war and staying. But Habibullah was not exactly pro-British, was he? It's not that he was pro. He just didn't want war. Is that correct?
Absolutely not. He was not pro-war. He was not pro-British. He believed personally that the time for Afghanistan gaining its diplomatic independence would come very shortly. And historians can't do what ifs, but he was probably right, especially in the wake of the First World War. Eventually, Afghanistan would have likely gained its independence diplomatically or naturally. They were already covertly conducting their own foreign affairs. They broke the Treaty of Gandamak pretty much all the time for the 30-year period that it was in effect. But Habibullah fully believed that diplomacy would win the day when it came to gaining their independence, and he was very good at it. He made a single blunder that I think sealed his fate in 1918 when he requested to have a seat at the table at the Paris Peace Conference. And the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, at this point, called the idea preposterous. And it took the king to send a letter to Habibullah to stop him from asking over and over again. And the letter basically that was read throughout Kabul because it was published basically showed Habibullah to be a British shill. Hello, my friend. I am so happy that you maintained your neutrality and you sent away the foreign ambassadors that you were, by the way, not supposed to receive. But I think the letter from King George completely sealed Habibullah's fate as ruler of Afghanistan, because then the pro-war party could actually paint him as pro-British for the most moderate of pro-war party members. And then it led to just a musical chairs of chaos in Kabul for the beginning of 1919.
So, to have a broad look at the cast of characters, could we introduce everyone and then talk briefly about or summarize briefly the internal factors and internal dynamics that you just went through?
Yeah, not only are there a lot of different characters in high Kabul society at this very point, but especially with the rulers, they all have very, very similar names. So you have obviously Habibullah Khan, the Emir of Afghanistan. You have Inayatullah Khan, his eldest son, but not legitimate. You have Nasrullah Khan, Habibullah's brother, the brother of the Emir. Both are open to cooing their respective brother and father. You also have Amanullah Khan, who was the focus of my paper and is the legitimate heir to Habibullah Khan and is fully siding with his father throughout this entire affair of World War One. You have military leaders that are very important in high Kabul society, such as Muhammad Nadir Shah, chief of the military of Afghanistan, associated with the clique that would be very pro-war. He would actually become king in 1929. That's how important he was in Kabul society. Another military leader would be Saleh Muhammad Khan, was one of the commander in chiefs of the Afghan military during its formation and would be one of the moderate voices that would need to be swayed to the side of pooing Habibullah. So at this point, and then you have Mahmoud Tarzi and his contemporaries in the civilian sphere. Also, it's worth mentioning, sorry, you also have the Free Indian Congress that are very obviously pro-war against the British. The belief of the war would be the Northwest frontier is so rotten of a structure that if it was to be invaded, then British India would more or less come crashing down as an administration authority. And the proponents of this were Raja Mahendra Pratap, president of the government of Free India in exile. He was in Kabul this entire time and was a fire starter in the anti-British bloc, as was Muhammad Baraktullah Bhopali, even more of a fire starter, both from the Punjab. So with all these crowds forming around, Habibullah really doesn't have anywhere to feel safe. The court is kind of all turning against him at once. In the first week of February, there's a reported attempt on his life in the bazaar of Kabul. It is told to him by his brother Nasrullah that Amanullah was responsible. Amanullah, he did not believe a word of that. He was fully aware that his brother was planning to overthrow him, but he couldn't move against him as his brother could move against him. So it really was a Game of Thrones style problem going on in Kabul. On February 19th, he goes hunting, as is very normal in Laghman province, south of Jalalabad. He leaves Amanullah to sit throne to hold court and deal with affairs in Kabul. He takes with him his son Inayatullah, Muhammad Nadir Shah, a handful of other courtiers, his brother Nasrullah, his other son Hayatullah, who would always agree with Inayatullah. So they kind of worked out as a pair. And that night, a servant sneaks into Habibullah's tent, puts a revolver against his ear, and kills Habibullah Khan. And then we have chaos with a very quiet and secret procession heading back to Jalalabad with Nasrullah proclaiming himself Emir. He contacts the British and says, "Do you recognize me as Emir?" The British talk amongst themselves and say, "It really isn't our business what they do within their own country, as long as we need to recognize the most prominent and popular Emir." And they didn't really know what was going on behind the wall that was the Khyber Mountains. Amanullah finds out after Nasrullah had contacted the British that his father was dead. It seemed pretty hopeless, but he had a few tricks up his sleeve, one of which was the fact that all of the people who were swearing allegiance to Nasrullah in Jalalabad, which was seen as less legitimate than Kabul, all of their families were in Kabul because they were all members of the Kabul court. Once he gets contact, because there is one telegram line in the entire country that spans outside one city, and it is Kabul to Jalalabad. Once he gets word that his mother is traveling from Jalalabad to Kabul and he knows that she's safe, he contacts Muhammad Nadir Shah, who's chief of the military at this point, who is in Jalalabad, and makes a threat and says all of the high command, all of the courtiers, their families will all die unless you arrest the traitors to my father's murder and come back to Kabul. And Muhammad Nadir Shah, who was a supporter of Nasrullah, but very quiet about it, makes a decision to arrest him on a Holy Friday in a mosque. And everybody goes back to Kabul. Amanullah proclaims himself ruler. The British recognize his proclaiming of ruler, and Nasrullah is thrown in prison. They blame a bodyguard or a colonel in the military and a bodyguard for assassinating Habibullah personally. The bodyguard is nowhere to be found. He actually died in Switzerland. Fun little fact. About 30 miles from where Amanullah died. The colonel in the military was executed by being pulled apart by horses. And it seemed for a few weeks that all was now well again in Afghanistan. But as I kind of point out in my paper, the events that were set in motion when Nasrullah took command and Habibullah was killed weren't able to be stopped even after Nasrullah was assassinated. The pro-war party was already on the path to actually achieving their goal of war. And there was really only one thing holding them back, and it wasn't Amanullah Khan, because he was a young and experienced ruler. His first week had been marred with illegitimacy. The fundamentalist Sunni ulema were now the moderate voices of should we go to war with the British? What would that accomplish? Why?
So, just to summarize, from the assassination of Habibullah to the start of the war, how much time are we talking about? Or more systematically, from the assassination of Habibullah to Amanullah's gaining control over the whole affair, how much time are we? Because it sounds like it was very quick, it happened all very fast, and a lot of things could have gone wrong in a lot of ways.
Was March 3rd is when Amanullah is fully in control of all of Afghanistan. Habibullah is assassinated February 19th. So that's about 12 days.
2 weeks, realize, yeah.
2 weeks, basically. And the time between that and the war starting is the war starts on May 6th of 1919. And if you had asked somebody, oh my God, the nation is on its way to war in early March of 1919, most people would have looked at you and said, what? However, behind the scenes, there were the more powerful members within Kabul society that knew very well that things were being set in motion already. The will of the people was a lot stronger than any one leader could be in Afghanistan.
When we say
Um,
the society was going to war, we're not talking about anything linear. It was all very dynamic and it was all very complicated. How do you think exactly it worked out that war came about? What really brought Afghanistan to war with the British at that time?
Everything about Afghan society is complicated. I'm not talking about the tribal regions of Afghanistan, but I'm talking about the Kabul society and that trickling down to ordinary people within Kabul. Kabul was a very modern city in Afghanistan at this point compared to the rest of Afghanistan. Very, very different. Jalalabad was sort of the same way, and some areas in Herat. But besides that, Afghanistan was still not very modernized. However, most information was passed down through proclamations and postings that were officially organized. So Amanullah gave a durbar when he fully took power in March, or a proclamation, basically legitimizing people's desire to be free from the British while also riding the line between being anti-war and pro-war. He was very good at that early on from his reign. So he would act against the pro-war party, but also slyly show that he was powerless and would not stop them. His proclamations very much influenced the people. We know that because of how much the tribesmen were willing to fight against the British once the war broke out. But there was one singular event in India about 600 miles away that would really actually sway the people's opinions against the British Empire. And when historians talk of this war, they either call it a jihad or an independence war. And it was a war of independence. It was technically a jihad if you bring the fundamentalists into it, and it was a war of national awakening. But the jihad comes from a horrible event in Amritsar, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre.
What happened exactly?
There was a lot of unrest in that part of 1919 in the Punjab. Contemporaries of Gandhi's early Satyagraha movement, which is his nonviolence movement, were arrested, and there were protests throughout Amritsar, and a couple Englishmen and women were, I think, two Englishmen were killed, and two women were assaulted in the city of Amritsar, which is nowadays on the border of India and Pakistan. If you ever see the gate celebration between Lahore and Amritsar, like that's where it happened. So it was a very mixed area in the Punjab. It was very Muslim, very Hindu, lots of Buddhists, and timing really did not work out with all the unrest. When martial law was declared in Amritsar on April 11th, the British administration, who was new in the Punjab, did not know that the Baisakhi festival, which was a Punjabi cultural festival, would be having millions of people proceeding into Amritsar by the 13th. Also coming into Amritsar was Colonel Reginald or Rex Dyer, who would take matters into his own hands without orders to do so. He's known as the Butcher of Amritsar. He really was a horrible person. He came in, posted signs without any knowledge of how Amritsar was working that said no meetings for more than three. There will be no warnings. Violators will be shot or arrested. That was a strategy that had been employed by the British in India before, but the people who were moving in for Baisakhi festival did not know that the unrest in Amritsar had been so bad. They had just arrived. So when they were all gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh Square, which is a sacred, holy place within the city of Amritsar, Dyer walked in with 52 men of the Gurkhas and the Sikhs. He fully intended to bring in armored cars with machine guns on top of them. And once he had organized all his men in a line, he did not give a warning to any of the huge crowd that were there. He just gave the order to fire. 1,650 rounds were fired. At least 1,500 people were dead, but it was actually not possible to get the full number. Many more were wounded. Dyer had ordered his men to fire into the thickest parts of the crowd, and he was blocking the only exit to the square. And when people tried to climb walls and escape through locked gates, he ordered them to fire at the other exits. So really just a horrible, horrible massacre and one of the darkest days in the very dark history of British India. This massacre sent a wave throughout the Muslim world entirely, but it very much hit Afghanistan very hard. With this, the mullahs and the sheiks of Western Afghanistan, especially, were up in arms, fully rare and ready to go. Amanullah did not want them to preach holy war. He actually privately had sent them requests to not preach holy war. They did anyway. They completely ignored him, and they were fully preaching jihad against the British by this point.
So you have internal factors driving Afghanistan to war. You have external factors. Amanullah himself, he wasn't pro-war, but he also kind of was. Where did he stand exactly in all of this?
He was not as nationalist as some of the elements in Kabul were. He definitely was a bit nationalist. He did not think his rule would survive a war with the British. He was not confident that the British would lose this war, or he wasn't even confident that the British wouldn't just completely overstep the Khyber Mountains and come right into Kabul. He knew that he couldn't do anything to stop, especially after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. So he gave another Durbar, and he was very, very precise in his wording. He got up and said, this was in late April, very late April. Do you want a holy war? Addressing the crowd in Kabul, and he wept for the dead at Jallianwala Bagh. And he would say, "God be with you." He very much wiped his hands of anything that was about to happen. Not only for the crowd of Kabul see him as not pro-British, but for probably the British, because he knew the British agent in Kabul would be watching, to see him as, oh, maybe he's not responsible for what just happened if something were to happen. And he was pretty smart in doing that because exactly what he thought would happen did happen.
So when we get to the war, how did it break out and how did it progress?
One thing we haven't talked about is that the Afghan military now was had a regular military at this point, but they also had triple the amount of tribesmen under their unofficial control. The tribesmen had sworn allegiance to the Emir of Afghanistan because he was their religious superior. However, they acted across the borders. They really didn't have a home in Afghanistan or in the Northwest frontier. They kind of lived in the mountains. These specific tribesmen. There were tribesmen all over Afghanistan, but these tribesmen that ended up being the start of the war. They were under the command of Salah Muhammad Khan and Muhammad Nadir Shah. Muhammad Nadir Shah had to he had to now share power over the military with Salah Muhammad Khan because of his possible quote unquote hand in the death of Habibullah. But he had control over the tribes. And a tribal leader, a Mashoud, I believe, under the name of Zar Shah, had crossed the frontier with a small band and moved into a water pumping station just over the Afghan border called Bagh, Bagh. They slaughtered the 6 Indian laborers that were working there and then set up camp in Bagh. This had happened before. There were many, like I said earlier, many tribal issues had existed over the decades. There was one in 1917 where the British had put down a tribal revolt. Where the tribesmen just fled back over the Khyber Mountains. So the British thought that that was what this was. Little did they know until they were fully aware that they were facing the Afghan regular military was that the Afghan military had formed a three-pronged invasion of British India. They had moved through the very northern mountainy terrain in the Chitral. They were preparing to make their full attack through the passes in the Khyber Mountains, and they were attacking through Balochistan. So once the British had gathered an appropriate response to a tribal issue, they were faced with not only tribesmen, but a fully fledged Afghan invasion.
Did I miss when we were talking about the army? How strong was the army? What was the population of the army? How did they compare to the British forces in India at that point?
In experience, they did not compare to the British Indian forces. The British Indian forces were very overstretched because they were actively demobilizing from the First World War. However, they had just fought in the First World War. They were seasoned troops. Some of the British Indian forces in the Northwest frontier had been brought in because they were so veteran to possibly quell the uprisings in the Punjab. Other forces in the Northwest frontier were home army version of the British Indians. So during the First World War, they were stationed in British India and saw no action. Even still, they were better trained and better equipped. The Afghans had formed their regular military only during the reign of Habibullah. They had adopted the tan uniforms that the British had. They had basically used older British pattern weapons from either the Second Afghan War or that they bought secondhand. Sometimes they had a rifle refinery in Kabul that would make the old Martini Henrys. Their artillery was ancient. Their machine guns were ancienter. Number wise, they numbered about 150,000 at first mobilization of Afghan regulars, and about triple that, somewhere from 500 to 700,000. We'll never actually know the number of tribesmen who had older weaponry, but they were guerrilla fighters. And the tribesmen were seen as the first front of the attack, and they would support a regular conventional military attack by being in the mountains and sniping at camps and doing the most possible damage to the British military.
So not a small army at all. It was a very substantial force for the time.
Yeah, very much a substantial force. The British mobilization within the first week of May. By May 9th is when the first battle at Bog took place. The biggest enemy in this war was the terrain. You could not fight with a lot of troops at one time because of how narrow the valleys were, because of how hard the mountains were to get through, especially if you were packing equipment. The Afghans would tow their artillery with pack animals. The British should have towed their artillery with pack animals because they had a lot of trouble getting the artillery through the mountains. It really was the biggest enemy was the environment and the terrain. More people died in the war to exposure, cholera, other types of diseases, sepsis, because things were so hard to get around than any kind of combat injuries.
On the 6th of May, the war starts, and on the 9th of May, the first real battle takes place. Is that correct? And how does the war progress from there?
The Afghans win the first Battle of Bog on the 9th of May. That is their only victory within the war. The British try to move up conventionally and then realize that they're faced with a full regular Afghan army and they have to pull back. When we have battles in this war, there's about six actual full battles that we would consider battles. The rest are more firefights, skirmishes, something very similar to American combat against the Taliban without the modern weaponry. So a battle's casualties in this war would be about 200 to 300 on both sides, give or take whoever wins the battle. There's a second Battle of Bog where the British push the Afghan military out of the pumping station of Bog and back over the Khyber border. The Afghans move through the more northern part of the Khyber border against the encampment at Sal, which is a major fortified position, and put siege to it for about a month. The British are able to push the Afghans out of the fortified position that they have in Balochistan and back over the Balochi border and are able to occupy part of southern Kandahar. In Chitral in the very north, there is a really tough battle because of just how horrible the terrain is. But the British are able to hold on to where the Afghans were pushing against, and the Afghans make no gains there. But as the Afghans were very hard to progress within the Punjab, the British were also very hard to progress in Afghanistan. The force that pushed the Afghans out of Bog only got to Low Dhaka, which is a small settlement on the Kabul River about 30 miles from Jalalabad. And they could not advance past Dhaka because then they were faced with the tribal frontiersmen that knew the terrain much better than them and would snipe at them from across the river all day long. And they were not able to go anywhere.
But still, the overall situation is more to the favor of the British, isn't it?
For weaponry and supply sake, but also because they have air power. It's one of the first uses of strategic bombing by the British. They would bomb Jalalabad, they bombed Kabul, they would use close air support very, very well in a style that they didn't use in the First World War. And the bombing of Kabul was what eventually convinced Amanullah Khan to fully seek peace on the terms of the British.
So, to give a very brief chronology, how does the war start, progress, and end? What ends the war aside from is it just the bombing of Kabul?
It's not the definite end. There were feelers on both sides of with telegram messages back and forth between Amanullah and the viceroy and the commander of the Northwest Frontier, George Roos Keppel, general, and the Secretary of State for India, all the way in London, Edwin Montagu. These feelers were the entire time trying to figure out why this war happened. While the war was happening, they have no idea what happened. They did not see Afghanistan as a threat. 2 weeks before, and for some reason they were a threat now. And there would be more or less a triangle of leadership between George Roos Keppel, Edwin Montagu, and Lord Chelmsford, the viceroy. All of them had different opinions on Amanullah and what share of blame he had. Of course, in today's world, you see a leader of a country that went to war with another country. You can't help but put some share of blame on him, and absolutely, you should a little bit. But in this case, Amanullah really could not have done anything to stop it. No matter who was emir, this war would have happened. Of course, the British administration did not know this. There was George Roos Keppel, who was a noted Afghanophobe, as attested to in multiple sources. He hated these people. He saw them as completely backward savages. He wanted them to be fully subservient to the British Indian administration because they could not contain their own people from crossing the border, according to him. He was fully convinced that any attempt at diplomacy was a ruse to stall. He was fully convinced that Amanullah was a fanatic who had ordered his people to attack. In many of the telegram sources, he doesn't refer to Amanullah by name. He just referred to him as the fanatic emir. Lord Chelmsford is actually very moderate and who had started to build a relationship with Amanullah over the course of a month after he took power and would talk to his boss, basically, Edwin Montagu, in a way that seemed kind of skeptical that Amanullah was to blame for this war. He would be very confused as to why Amanullah was doing this now, why after World War I was over, why the country has basically taken up full people's arms against the British, kind of convinced that Amanullah was not to blame. Edwin Montagu could not care less. He was focused on the Paris Peace Conference, and this was probably the worst type of headache he possibly could have during the Paris Peace Conference.
So the war ended in June, July.
The armistice that was agreed upon was on June 2nd, not even 30 days after the war started. The actual peace, which was negotiated and agreed upon at Rawalpindi in Northwest Frontier, was signed in August 12th, I believe.
So despite the mobilization that really impressed me by the Afghan forces, the war did end up being really brief.
The biggest tells that this was a path to war that was longer than the week that followed Jallianwala Bagh massacre was that they were able to mobilize this massive force within such a short time. This force was probably being prepared and drilled and trained from the time that Habibullah was assassinated, not from the time that the Jallianwala Bagh massacre happened. But it turned out to be a war, and by the time the war was over, the Afghans had exhausted their material. They had nothing left. They had no ammo. Most of their guns had been captured by, or destroyed by the British, though that is artillery. They really could not fight anymore. The only people that had weaponry still were the frontier tribesmen. And the tribal issue that came as a result of this war lasted until 1920, where the British had to basically exterminate a lot of tribes on the border. They didn't have to, but they did. And it led to about 50 to 60,000 deaths on the Northwest frontier because the tribesmen were fully in a state of war against the British and did not recognize any type of peace.
I will get to the impact of the war, what the war really meant, but we did touch upon it. But I had a separate question for the characteristics of warfare that was conducted through the war. So you said we had some conventional clashes or conflict. We had guerrilla warfare, as is necessary and is what you would expect from any kind of conflict in Afghanistan. But also we have air combat, or not air combat, but airstrikes and close air support. Could you walk us through that?
It was mostly when it came to conventional fighting, which was the most destructive part of the conflict when it came to life. It would be small arms exchanges over different sides of a mountain valley, and that was basically the entire thing. That if they were at the top of a mountain ridge, they could not ship an artillery gun up there to try to dislodge positions. They could not. A supply was a huge issue in the Punjab because things were being sabotaged by the Free Indian insurgents. That was the plan for the Afghans to maybe Free India would fully rise up when they saw that there was an invasion, but they had to get more than 15 miles through the border, and they didn't. The Afghans were not trained on any kind of artillery. They did not know how to use it. They would pack it with black powder because that was all they had, because they did not have charging cartridges with the artillery shells. So the artillery wouldn't really shoot far. Most of it was like old prep guns from the from that would be used in like the Franco-Prussian War in the 1870s. Their machine guns were like the crank guns from the Civil War, the American Civil War, and other weaponry like that. They were not able to functionally operate in a combined arms style of warfare, and the British, while it was very hard to do in the terrain, were with air power, with different styles of artillery. They any kind of pack animal or cavalry was useless by the time they got across the Khyber Mountains. So it was a really tough war where basically the only thing that killed people were rifle fire. The bombings of Kabul and Jalalabad. Jalalabad did have victims. The bombing of Kabul had no victims, but had a psychological effect. Not only because, oh, the British are able to get to Kabul now without having to traverse across very hard terrain, but also they had bombed significant areas. They bombed the Ark, which is Amanullah's palace, and they also, across the city, they bombed the mausoleum of Habibullah. So they destroyed the remains of Amanullah's father.
As for casualties, do we know how many people died in the conflict?
We have combat casualties for the British and the Afghans assumed. Afghan regular casualties from combat were about 2,000. British was about 1,500. On both sides, about 20,000 each died from disease. That be sepsis. There was a couple cases of the British dying of thirst because supply was a massive issue in this war. So there's a couple deaths from exposure and malnutrition, but also cholera, as is the case with the British in Afghanistan, every time runs rampant, especially when you have such a small water source shared by so many people. And on the Afghan side, we can't really count how many died from the elements or sickness because they really did not write anything down, which was a huge issue overall trying to study this paper or study this topic.
So the results of the war, the immediate results of the war. I will separately ask about the overall impact of it, but the immediate results were, yeah, two different things.
When the armistice was signed, the viceroy had told the emir all of his terms, that being the standing down of the Afghan military, the allowing of the British forces to march all the way to Jalalabad unimpeded, the allowing of occupation of southern Kandahar, and a lot of other logistical things that would allow the British to actually treat their wounded, to supply their soldiers that were occupying further on. After the armistice was signed, some fighting with the regulars continued, notably because of one now Brigadier General Dyer, the butcher of Amritsar, was in command of the Thal fort that was being sieged. The siege was going to be let off, and as the Afghans were retreating, he wanted to fire more guns at them. So he had ordered an artillery strike on a disarmed retreating enemy. Once they organized negotiations at Rawalpindi, thankfully, both the British administration and the Afghan emir and the pro-war members had picked a moderate voice to negotiate on their respective countries' behalf. So when they had both picked very moderate voices, the Afghan voice was Ali Ahmad Shargasi, also another future emir for about 6 months in the chaos that was the 1929 revolution in Afghanistan. He was a very moderate voice and a member of Amanullah's family. So he would be seen as the more sensible diplomat to send to Rawalpindi rather than Mahmoud Tarzi, who would probably not be the firebrand you want to negotiate the end of a war that you just lost. The British acted in kind, and they sent another moderate voice, Sir Hamilton Grant. He was a British Indian diplomat who had dealt with the Afghans for 20 years and had gained a certain modicum of respect among the people that had dealt with him in Kabul. They did go back and forth. Brian Robson, in his book on this topic, it's a beautiful operational history of the war, has fantastic quotes that were written down and recorded in the His Majesty's Indian Archives. They got heated. They were sweaty, screaming in each other's faces about who was to blame. Hamilton Grant, in all his cool, calm, and collected posture, was furious at any notion that the Afghans were in any position to negotiate anything. But because of the state of the world and what was going on in the north, the Russian Civil War was in full swing. Afghanistan could not be seen as continued occupation like it was in 1880. It could not be occupied without killing British soldiers. They were trying to demobilize the British Indian Army. They couldn't just have be forever on the alert for another independence war.
which is one of the factors that they used Greeks in Turkey at the same time.
uh, British society was exhausted. And the British military was exhausted, and the British Indian administration was dealing with near complete dissolution of their colonial empire. So holding on to Afghanistan, which would cause more deaths, was pointless. And having a ally as a buffer state would be much more beneficial. So it wasn't a war that ended with status quo antebellum. It is a war that ended with Afghanistan gaining its independence after losing the war. What was withdrawn from them was the fact that they were being paid British subsidies every month, a lot of money. None of it went into development of Afghanistan because there really wasn't anything that they could develop. Most of it went into buying the old guns that they had just used against the British. So no more subsidies. They also had to recognize fully the Durand Line, the lineations of the Russian border and the Indian border, part of which they couldn't even draw fully until they had planes that could climb higher than the actual mountains. But that was a big point of contention of Afghan nationalism that they had pieces taken away from them because of the British delineation of the border. So they had to recognize the border. They lost their subsidies, and then they were fully able to gain diplomatic independence. If there were no conflicts with the British over the course of 1 year, they would sign a lasting treaty of Anglo-Afghan friendship that would basically solidify their alliance as non-belligerent states.
Did the war actually start off as a war of independence?
Is the academic question. That was part of what I thought my thesis was going to be, but then I focused way more on Amanullah and his guilt and what he was probably thinking during the war. I'd say that was a third of the reason it started. I'd say it definitely was a reactionary war after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Holy War is stretch, real stretch, especially since the majority of the British Indian forces that originally fought on the frontier were Muslim forces. So Holy War, I wouldn't call it that. Independence War, Reactionary War, National Awakening War is what I call it. Those are my three. National Awakening War is probably the one that doesn't get talked about enough, but Afghanistan wasn't a formed national identity in the second Afghan war. It almost was, but it wasn't fully, and it had formed in peacetime, and it was building up and forming pressure, especially as it had an overlord that it didn't want. And once it was able to break out, it exploded into this war that more or less let it thrive. And I think the smart, sensible thing that could only have happened after a conflict such as the First World War was the British saying, we're not going to be able to contain this. We might as well let it go.
So, is it safer to academically state that it only started off as a reactionary war and then developed into a national awakening and a war of independence? Because when you say it was a war of national awakening, is it a root cause or is it one of the results that it produced?
We'd say the root cause is a war of independence. That is the root cause. The war itself started as a reactionary war, and the pro-independence movement kind of grabbed hold of that, and it was off once those two had agreed on that. And the national awakening that kind of formed, that had already formed in Afghanistan, also latched onto that, and it was just off to the races when all three of those things that were basically guiding all of Afghan intelligentsia, fundamentalists, nationalists. If a country, every bitter political party in a country can agree on one thing, that's usually the one thing that's going to happen.
So, my main takeaway from your thesis was that this is the war that formed modern Afghanistan as a nation, or at least a more nationalistic modern Afghanistan as a country. Is this correct? Is this the main takeaway, or what would you say the complete impact is of this war? Not just on Afghanistan, but also on Britain, on India, on the region as well.
It did form Afghanistan as a modern nation. That is correct. Afghanistan is not a nation state. There are multiple, there is no one Afghan people. There are Pashtuns, Tajiks, Hazaras, so many within this geographically enclosed country, but it is a naturalized border of a nation, and it formed in modernity as a modern state that we would know it after this war because of this war. The Second War showed Afghanistan as not some feudal lands of a conqueror that was not united at all. It really showed it was united, but it was completely unmodernized, muskets, no electricity, nothing. By the time the 1919 war was over, Afghanistan was a modern state in Central Asia. They were instituting reform. Amanullah was instituting reforms after this war that would be seen even in Europe at the time as a bit more progressive. It really came into its own adulthood when they broke free from the British.
Aside from its impact on Afghanistan itself, what would you say the overall impact of the war was on the maybe did it have any impact on the global order or whatever was left of it at that time?
Would think I think I don't know what you're referencing, but I would assume that you're referencing something like Japan in 1905, or any kind of other colonial uprising or something like that. I've seen it compared to Ireland, 1919. I don't know if that's fair to either the agency of either the Irish revolutionaries or Afghanistan. However, it does show a change of the notion of empire. So it's more of a symptom of the changing of the world order than it is a cause of change of the world order. It did not change much. If anything, it made Northwest India a lot more stable because while there was a war that happened, a year later, it couldn't have been more stable than it was in 1919, 1918. It really secured British interests in the Northwest because it went from a place of overall anxiety for the past 200 years of the Great Game and tribal issues to a secure modern country that was able to keep its more rural people in check. So it changed a little bit regionally. It changed. It completely went under the radar. If you had asked a German delegation at Paris in 1919, they would say what? So it did not have reverberation throughout the world. He did. I mean, Amanullah did reach out after the war to pretty much every major power on Telegram to ask for recognition as a state. Turkey, Soviet Union, even though it was in the grips of a war, Germany, France, the U.S., Belgium. Pretty much no one responded except for the Soviets who recognized them immediately. I think they were kind of vying for friends at that point. Once the Anglo-Afghan friendship was signed in 1920, the powers that were allied with British began to recognize them. Belgium, France, the US all recognized Afghanistan by 1922. So it really just formed Afghanistan into the post-World War world.
So, it's a very, very interesting topic, and I do believe it might relate to some other things that we want to talk about on this channel, not least the whole Turkish War of Independence. Although the time frame doesn't quite match, Turkey and Afghanistan were, their fates were in a lot of ways in some weird ways as well intertwined throughout the 1920s and 1930s. But that's the topic of another video, and I'm leaving all Turkey related comments to another video because the recording itself has been around almost 2 hours. I don't know what it will end up after the edit, but it's a long video, so I'm not keen on making it any longer. So if Alex approves, we should move on to sources or the lack thereof. had to work with very few sources. Am I right?
And before I forget, I did forget to say that I also see this war compared to the Turkish War of Independence a lot. So that's very common in overall. Primary sources on this topic are very hard to find. I was forced to work with and also justify myself in only using British administrative sources, military telegrams too, basically any telegram the British copy down and keep forever in their libraries and digitize most of them, thankfully. The Afghans, if they wrote stuff down, they wrote it down on paper with a pen, uh, and it is gone. There are apparently some sources in the University of Kabul. I considered sending an email to the Taliban. I decided against it. There are also sources in the University of Tehran that are paper sources. Also, I don't think I would be welcome there. So because of the state of the world today, it's even harder to study. Um, there are a few sources that are in Russian. After the revolution in 1929, a lot of Afghans fled to the Soviet Union and were given full refuge there. The rest mostly fled to Italy and Spain because I guess it's a similar climate. So I don't read Russian. Much like our 1916 Central Asian revolt, I am at a disadvantage there. So British sources are kind of how I had to piece this together. And there are a lot of British sources on this, and there's a lot of secondary literature. I also did not travel for this. I could not travel for this. So I couldn't go to India and I couldn't go to, I didn't get the time to go to London because I know I'm preaching to the choir of somebody who very much is diligent and goes to archives in the UK. Uh, but from what I saw, there isn't much more than what I saw digitized. Maybe some like field reports from the military, but nothing that would like be the biggest eye opener for what was going on in Kabul during the war. So basically, what we have digitized is what we got. And unless someone discovers something buried deep within an archive somewhere that no one else has seen, that's the only way we're going to have this war studied. The best secondary source is a work by Rhea Talley Stewart, and she is somebody who found these buried sources in British archives. She had special access to redacted and secret files within the India office in the 70s, and she wrote this amazing book called Fire in Afghanistan, which is more or less a biography of Amanullah more than anything. But it because of how central he is, it takes us through the entirety of the Afghan 20s and the 1919 war and everything. Other secondary literature have basically all used the same sources that she has or used her because sometimes she's not even able to list the sources that she has. But she's been, if there's any doubt that she is being truthful with her sources, pretty much every other historian on the region has given her the okay, not posthumously, because she's unfortunately no longer with us. But when secondary literature talks about this conflict, it talks about it in the greater scheme of something, in the greater scheme of British Indian troubles, in the greater scheme of the post World War One Central Asian world, maybe Persia they're talking about, maybe a lot of times actually they're talking about Turkey. So it's only a few, very few sources are talk about this 1 month plus maybe 2 months before period of conflict just itself. There is one other primary source that I wouldn't call rightly a primary source because it is not academic and more or less just a memoir. A major, G.N. Molesworth, retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1936, wrote his account in the 1930s of the Afghan War, and he writes it from a very interesting perspective. And I think we can close on this because it is kind of poetic. He writes it on a kind of lamenting that it's gone completely unremembered in British military society, history, anything. And this was in the 1930s. This was before World War II happened. So, like, it was very recent in memory, and there wasn't another big one after. And with all of the things that have been piled on, G.N. Molesworth, his account is sometimes wrong. Like, there are actual primary sources that completely disprove. Sometimes he says the official British history of this war leaves out this, and this actually happened. And you could take that with a grain of salt. he basically lies about General Dyer, and says that he didn't do anything wrong until after the war, where he actually had committed the massacre and it caused the war. But you could take his account as there has been so much in Afghanistan since this has happened. Afghanistan has been a center of attention for years and years and years. So if it was so understudied and underremembered in 1936, that was after the Afghan Revolution in 1929. Then you had assassination of Nadir Shah in the 1940s, and you had constitution was established, and then another revolution that fully abolished the monarchy, and then another revolution, and then another one, and then invasion, and then another. Like, there's been so much in Afghanistan that we kind of forget to go all the way back to why it is a state and why it is important in the scheme of the region and the world.
Afghanistan is again very central. Maybe geographically, it's not as central as it's important geostrategically, but for a lot of global matters, it is of central importance and it is of critical importance. For Turkey as well. Turkey has deep relations with Afghanistan or has had deep relations with Afghanistan since the early 20s. So it's a very interesting topic for me. And once again, Alex has enabled me to delve a bit deeper into or be introduced to altogether to a topic that I would otherwise not have even heard of. So that was a privilege of mine. I have to thank Alex for that. Um, Other than that, I do fully intend to again keep Alex as a prisoner and have him make another video on possibly Afghanistan or my hope is that we keep seeing Alex on our channel, which is just an excuse for me to see my friend because now we do not live in the same city, in the same country, or in the same continent. And I do not intend to go back for the graduation ceremony in December to Dublin. So it might be some time before I physically can see Alex. So we have to make do with the recordings, and History After All is great at bringing people together. I love how this channel has enabled me to really chat with a lot of people that I just wanted to chat with. This is one of the main points of the channel. So again, it was very understudied, but it's very important as a topic. And Alex has a tendency to go for the underdogs when it comes to choosing academic topics. This was the case with the Central Asian Revolt, and this was the case with Afghanistan. One small question before we finish. Do you have any intentions to publish your thesis academically so our viewers, if they're interested, can reach it? Or because the final thing is, master's theses in Turkey are published and accessible by everybody. You don't even have to be in Turkey, or you don't have to be Turkish. But with UCD, where we wrote our thesis, um, they're not really stored anywhere that is accessible by anybody else other than us. That's one question.
No, to answer that question, I would have to get it back from UCD first because at the time of this recording, we have not received our grades on the theses yet. But maybe I am. It's not out of the question at all. I would, if it's good enough, I will do my best to maybe try.
Thank you so much, Alex. It has been very fun for me, and it was very enlightening. It was a huge privilege to go through all of this with you. Thanks so much. And thank you to everybody who watched and listened. And hopefully, we will see Alex again, and I will see everybody else real soon, hopefully, in the next English video.